Thank you so much for joining us today at the webinar. We hope this call finds you safe and healthy. And while we're all looking for ways to navigate this unique moment in history, we're also thinking about what comes next and how innovation, and particularly healthcare innovation, can play an all-important role. This webinar, the COVID-19 discussion, was created to just explore that. I'm Vas Bailey, partner at ARTIS Ventures. And as you know, for the past 2 decades, we've been supporting companies like YouTube, StemCentrix, Palantir, and for the past 5 to 6 years, we've been investing at the intersection of technology and biology. And in this unique moment in time, we've seen that many of our portfolio companies, as well as companies in general, including the 3 that have joined us here today, have played an important role and are playing an important role as we fight the pandemic. I'm honored to have here to join me today. We have 3 distinct voices joining us from the world of diagnostics. We have GC. The world of technology and AI, we have Connor. And from the world of therapeutics, the world of cures, the world of HIV cures, but also viral cures, we have Daniel Dornbusch. Before we get into introducing them, let's just think about the 2 ways in which we can put an end to the pandemic and how we can move back to what we will describe as the new normal, because it'll never be the same as we move forward. But if we think about the new normal, the first approach, which I'm sure you all see every day in the news and media, is the public health response or an epidemiological response wherein things like shelter in place, wearing masks, which are important, or the other aspects of washing your hands, are all important responses that'll help in flattening the curve and also helping reduce the severity of this pandemic. But on the other hand, what we're focused on today is not that public health response, but we're focused on innovations in healthcare, in diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics, AI, and technology that can, in one way, put an end to a pandemic like this, or future threats that we will have in healthcare that I'm sure we'll be plagued with for years to come. And this innovation is one small fragment of innovation that's going on across the world. And we're happy to share our perspective. And it's ever so important to share facts and data as we see that in the world of news, we have people talking about taking drugs that have not gone through regulatory approval. We see people talking about a whole host of vaccines that will be on the markets and for you to take this fall. Unfortunately, as much as we'd like to know that's true, it isn't. And we also think about the fact that diagnostics, is it the lack of diagnostics or is it not? As of even today, we can tell you that there are 64 diagnostics, 45 treatments, and 8 vaccines that have hit humans, and over 130 serological tests that are available that allow us to test our immune system and a response of our antibodies against COVID-19. Well, we'll talk about that today, but before we delve into a particular topic, I'd love to give a minute to each of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us, and maybe GC, we can start with you. If you don't mind describing who you are, but also what your company does, that'd be a great start.
Thank you, Vas, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be on this panel. My name is Guochun Liao. People call me GC. My background is in genomics. I got my PhD in genetics and a master in machine learning from UC Berkeley. I have been involved in genomics for almost 25 years now. So I worked for Roche for many years and then many years in biotech startups. Especially for the last 10 years, I was involved in startup companies related to the next generation sequencing. I am one of the co-founders and the CEO of IDbyDNA. Very briefly, at IDbyDNA, we utilize next generation sequencing and the computational approach for infectious disease diagnostics. So basically, we take a patient sample and sequence all genetic material from it. I mean, as we know, all living thing has a genetic material: virus, bacteria, fungi, parasites, us. So we sequence them all. By doing this, we basically convert a patient sample to millions of DNA fragments. And then we use machine learning, big data, statistics to analyze those sequence data and identify what's the causal pathogen. So this approach basically enables us to do hypothesis-free diagnostics. And we can pretty much to identify any pathogen in any sample. Thank you.
Thank you, GC. Connor, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Vas, and honored to be on the panel as well, and appreciate the chance to share about the things that we're working on at Eko. Eko is a medtech company building technologies to help us understand how our hearts and lungs are functioning using sound. This is sound that we would traditionally capture with, you could think of it as a stethoscope, but we use deep learning and AI to help us provide automatic disease detection and monitoring of patients' cardiac and pulmonary function just using the sound that those organs produce. So we've built the world's largest data set of heart sound and lung sound information, and we have a library and a repository of different disease states like pneumonia, COPD, asthma, different types of heart murmurs. And we can, through deep learning, do a comparison to help quickly provide clinicians with insight into whether that patient has a pathology or disease present, and then provide very precise, low-cost monitoring for patients who've been previously diagnosed with those diseases.
Thank you. Dan?
Hi, I'm Daniel Dornbusch, and Vas, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to the ARTIS team for putting this on. We appreciate it. I'm the CEO of Excision BioTherapeutics. It's a company focused on gene editing technologies to cure viral infectious diseases, sort of an area that has come into its own in the last several weeks. My background's in genetics with masters in public health as well as business, and then I spent the last 20-something years in mostly large biotech and pharma, Genzyme, Sanofi, then Genentech, Novartis, several small biotechs. Just a note on Excision, we specifically use CRISPR to remove viral genomes and therefore cure, ideally, potentially cure patients of viral diseases. We are the first company in history to cure HIV in animals, and we're targeting our first clinical trial later in 2020. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So as you all see, with this perspective represented, and you think about ending any pandemic, the world of diagnostics is important because it allows us to identify the patients who are infected and allow us to have that public response. Either we treat them, or we use public health policies like shelter at home, or we allow them to come back to work based on a serological test. The world of AI and tech enable us to think about monitoring in different ways. Telemedicine, we'll get into that world. And the world of treatments is perhaps what will give us and put a stop to this and allow us to come back to that new normal. But as we start with the world of diagnostics, GC, give us a sense of, has IDbyDNA been involved in any COVID response? And give us a sense of the diagnostic tests that are currently available on the market. What are they like? And we've all heard about the problem with diagnostics and testing. Why is that happening?
Okay. Yeah, so let me talk about first, current existing tests for COVID-19. Most COVID-19 tests today, approved by FDA, EUA process is a PCR based. So briefly, a PCR test is basically designed specific probes to target, certain regions on the viral genome. So first of all, you have to know the genome sequence first. Secondly, those probes are pretty specific. So any mutation might cause the probe doesn't work. And also, a lot of the tests are kind of released kind of at a rush. So there's of course, their quality, there's variable qualities. I think that's probably the early times when we see, high false positive rate. So even, the PCR test is very well designed, but it still has its own issues. But typically, the PCR test can only give you a yes or no answer. And for like a patient with infection, so they might have a COVID-19, but they might also have co-infections. But also for sick patient with COVID-19 negative, they're still sick, right? So you still need to figure out what caused their problem. So PCR, in terms of surveillance, then PCR does not provide like a genome information, cannot be used for like, tracking, emerging viral strains, the viral evolution, all those things. So what we doing in basically using the sequencing, we can provide a lot more information. So IDbyDNA was actually one of our early responders to COVID-19. We have one test, what we call the X5 registry. It's an NGS next generation sequencing-based test. It's validated for over 900 relevant, the respiratory pathogens, including virus, bacteria, fungi, and some parasites. So in January, we upgraded this test to enable it to detect the novel coronavirus. So this is another advantage of talking about, the sequencing-based approach, because in terms of, the wet lab workflow process-wise, there's no difference. But in order to identify any new pathogen, we can just simply update the database. So in the case for this X5 registry, in the case to identify, the COVID-19 virus, so we basically, in general, we update our database, then the same test can detect, the coronavirus.
So I just want to let everyone else know, because this is something you were just telling me before everyone else joined, a real case, and this was in California, wherein a patient felt that the patient had pneumonia and got tested by the IDbyDNA test. And the patient was convinced, given COVID-19 going out, had pneumonia-like symptoms, got tested and found out that was negative based on the IDbyDNA test for COVID-19, but was positive for bacterial pneumonia. The first quote from this patient was that, "I've never been more happier to know that I have pneumonia," and that it was not COVID-19. But what you start to see is the layer of complexity in healthcare, whereas people who are put on ventilators many times get secondary infections. And the infections are often fungal or bacterial. And a simple digital test like PCR does not enable us to just get a sense of, because all you're testing for is that one thing you hypothesized. But perhaps a technology like yours enables you to see a whole host of pathogens. But GC, give us a sense of, we've had these tests that are approved in regulatory system in here in the US and across the world. What are some of the challenges in testing? And how can we scale this testing for people across the world?
Right. For sequencing-based tests, the challenge was typically like I see there are two big challenges. One is the sequencing-based test is always much more complex, right? So it's a high complexity test in terms of wet lab protocol, workflow-wise, and also analysis. So, for the last 5 years, we have been working on this to streamline the process. So I think we now can make it much more easily implemented by the clinical lab. It's not like a PCR, as convenient as PCR yet, but it's pretty close. The second part is, typically when we talk about sequencing, people are thinking about high cost, right? So I think, over the last several years, the sequencing cost has been keep going down. And also we're now partnering with Illumina to further drive down the cost. I think now, in terms of the easy to implement and also in terms of cost, I think we are ready to using the NGS approach for infectious disease diagnostics for the mass market now.
That's great. And so let's move from that just pure presence or absence of disease to serological tests. We've seen that in the news a fair bit. The White House made comments on serological testing even yesterday. There are over 130 tests that the ARTIS team were able to compile as we track innovation in this space. That's 130 tests around the world. And what is really strange about these tests is we couldn't find on a single website, or very few, sensitivity and specificity listed on these serological tests. Can you explain to the attendees, what are serological tests in this case? Can it be used to detect disease? But if not, what is it used for? And why does sensitivity or specificity matter in diagnostic tests?
Okay. Yeah. So a serological test, it's not to detect the virus itself. It's more like a detect our body's immune response, right? So when we expose to a pathogen, so our body will develop antibody to protect us. So typically, a serological test is to measure the antibodies, in response to a specific infection, like COVID-19. The because, however, it takes time for our body to develop antibodies. So in the early days of any infection, a serological test may not work because, either we haven't developed the antibody yet, or, it's just the level is too low to be detected. I think, a lot of the interest around the serological test today is because if it is true, we can develop, immunity against, the COVID-19 virus, then serological tests can tell us who has already been exposed and who are already developed immunity. So this is potentially indicators for, when we can kind of let people go back to work. So that's, I think there's a lot of interest around that. In terms of sensitivity and specificity, so those are kind of two most important measurements for like any diagnostic test. But just by the name, sensitivity is, it kind of measure how sensitive test, right? So, for example, if we know a population, there are like 100 positive patients within a population, then how many tests can detect out of those 100, positive patients? So basically, it's sensitivity is basically the true positive rate. On the other hand, the specificity is measured like a true negative rate. So it's basically saying, is there this test called too many false negatives, right? So typically, for any test, there's a trade-off between, sensitivity and specificity. So you increase the one, you decrease another. So it depends on the scenario, right? For example, when we want to...
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, man.
Understand. Would it be fair for me to say that sensitivity and specificity-wise, in the diagnostic test, say presence or absence of COVID-19, sensitivity mattered a fair bit more, and false negatives were bad. Sensitivity was important. For the world of the serological tests, specificity matters as well, because in this case, we want people to think that they're okay and go back into the work. So specificity matters.
Exactly. Because COVID-19 is highly contagious, right? So we don't want to miss any positive. So this is where the sensitivity matters, because if you not sensitive enough, then you put someone like already infected and out, right? So that will cause a lot of more issues. And for the serological test, basically we want to determine who has already developed immunity. So then we don't want to miss a negative. So this is where the specificity is more important.
Great, thank you, GC. Connor, let's hear from you a little bit in terms of the use of technology and AI. Can you tell us a little bit of how that is being used in the world of COVID-19, and specifically, is Eko involved in any way in the COVID-19 response?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Vas. At its most core level, the manifestation we see of the coronavirus and of COVID-19 is primarily a pulmonary disease, in which we have significant respiratory problems, either caused by the inability for the lungs to exchange oxygen and the inability of the patient to, keep their blood fully oxygenated because of this coronavirus. And so, for clinicians, we have this really challenging task, which is both triage an enormous number of patients, determine those who are at most risk, hospitalize or monitor those patients, and then discharge the rest of those patients and send them home with some follow-up instructions and some monitoring capabilities. The second challenge is, we know comorbidities are a significant cause of complications, and so we need to identify those patients who may be at a low risk, but because of complications or comorbidities, could be at high risk in the future. So clinicians need frontline tools to be able to do that quickly and effectively. And our products, we've seen a very significant uptick in the number of clinicians using our devices to do frontline screening. One of our products is it's basically a handheld device that can be placed upon the chest to capture cardiac function, or on the lung regions to capture pulmonary function. And then we can provide an interpretation and AI assessment of their cardiac function. And then the clinicians can listen to the lung sounds and assess the pulmonary function. This has to be done very quickly. We have to be able to do this with, limited resource and limited contact with the patient, because at the end of the day, it's still extremely infectious for the frontline clinicians. The other challenge we're seeing is for the patients who would be coming into the clinic, there's now a massive access problem, in that you don't want a patient with congestive heart failure coming back to the clinic because of the huge risk that they, are in contact with a patient with COVID. So we now have to deliver all of the care that we were previously providing to non-COVID patients, but do that over video, do that through remote telemedicine. And the significant challenge there is, how do we, capture vital sign data? How do we truly assess this patient's function without having to, without being able to do a physical exam or without being able to capture real vital signs? And so our devices, we just got a exemption from the FDA to be able to send our devices home with patients to allow them to do home monitoring or remote patient care for especially the significantly at-risk chronic disease patients. And what was really fascinating was to see the level of speed with which the FDA turned that around. A typical, FDA approval like that might take 6 months or 9 months for them to process an application and review our safety and our performance data. In this situation, we got clearance from the FDA in 6 days, which is unheard of. We were just absolutely blown away by the speed of turnaround from the FDA.
Connor, let's touch upon that for a little longer. FDA and regulatory, especially when it comes to tech and AI. Given that we're in the Valley in San Francisco, it seems that everyone with a computer thinks that healthcare in this case would be easy enough to code, and as what you bring will be adopted by doctors across the world. You've taken a very different approach by making sure that regulatory has been involved in every aspect of your company building, and you've gone down that path a fair bit. As you think about your technological advantage, or whether your company or healthcare tech AI companies, one, how is regulatory, how does it play a role in adoption across the world? And second, do you feel like, you told us this before we got started on this panel today, you said you're probably the most connected cloud device in the world of healthcare and hospital systems across the world. Is that ability for you to be able to have done that, the fact that you've gone down the regulatory path, which gives comfort? Maybe just speak to us about regulatory and healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as a technology company, dealing with the FDA or dealing with regulatory bodies does, slow us down substantially. And I think that obviously adds heartburn to many investors who are scared to think about investing in a regulated company. But at the end of the day, healthcare is slow moving and cautious for a reason, and we're dealing with human life. And so it's critical for us to invest the time in demonstrating the safety, the efficacy, and the clinical performance of any technology that we build. It's really wonderful to see the ways that FDA has not necessarily reduced the evidence burden, but has just accelerated some of the bureaucratic time that would have been there previously. I think as a medtech and a healthcare company, the FDA and the regulatory stamps of approvals are very important to clinician adoption and healthcare community acceptance. We've seen lots of pushback and concern from both physicians and from the regulatory bodies when we talk about unapproved trials or with therapeutics that have limited data. At the end of the day, the healthcare system should be driven by data first and foremost, and the goal is just how quickly we can capture that with a minimal bureaucratic headaches and paperwork issues.
And there is one other level, which is, even if you do get the regulatory approval, someone has to pay for it. And I would say once in 100 years, healthcare or industry is completely woken up or just completely shook up. And this has happened in the world of healthcare. What we see now is the CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid, starting to reimburse physicians for televisits. We've started to see that telehealth, telemedicine, but also remote monitoring has absolutely increased. Can you maybe give us a few thoughts on and would you agree that this has been a shakeup to the world of healthcare? Yeah,
absolutely. It's truly a totally unprecedented shakeup, and I think once in 100 years is not too strong of a claim to make. Telemedicine has been around for 10, 15, 20 years, but it's always been very limited in terms of how it could be used and how it would be paid for. And previously, Medicare and Medicaid and most insurance companies, at least in the US, had extremely narrow definitions of when they would pay for healthcare. There were very restrictive rules that said the patient has to be in a rural area, they have to be more than X number of hours from another hospital before insurance would pay for telemedicine. And so it just never gained broad acceptance because there wasn't this payment, and physicians really couldn't get reimbursed for the time spent caring for that patient. And overnight, a couple of weeks ago, Medicare and Medicaid with a $1 trillion budget said, as long as the care is being delivered to the patient, it can be fully virtual and Medicare and Medicaid will still pay for it. And now we've seen all of the other major insurance players, the Cignas, the Blue Cross Blue Shields, we've seen all of the major insurance carriers now start to shift and start to pay for telemedicine in the exact same way that Medicare and Medicaid has. And so I think we finally opened the floodgates and said, as long as you're caring for that patient, as long as you're delivering and providing them access to healthcare services that they wouldn't be able to access otherwise, we will reimburse for that. And so, I think every system has seen thousands of percentage point increases, and it's really thousands. It's like 5,000, 10,000 percentage point increases in the number of telemedicine visits that they're doing. And we're now hitting these crossover points where healthcare systems are doing more visits remotely than they're doing in clinic, even with this COVID rush. Even with all of the surge in COVID patients we're seeing, they're still doing more visits remotely, which is pretty spectacular and crazy to think. And I think the feedback in general is that patients are really appreciative of the flexibility that remote care gives them, the ability for them to get on the phone with their physician, do a video visit, do a checkup, check in on how their heart is functioning, check in how their lung is functioning if they have chronic disease, without having to take the time to go into the clinic and without exposing themselves to other pathogens.
And Connor, so we understand that from what you've built, it works in clinic where the AI is actually useful and these algorithms do better than listening manually from a cardiologist or pulmonologist. But how about the use of AI in remote monitoring and telehealth? What does that look like, and how is that going to evolve both for you but also as an industry?
Yeah, absolutely. For many patients, especially those with chronic cardiovascular disease or pulmonary disease, think asthma, COPD, congestive heart failure, valvular heart diseases. These are millions and millions of patients. And for many of them, the ability to monitor how their heart or lung is functioning is critical in being able to personalize their care and change their treatment plans to keep them healthy. And so, with these new payment structures and reimbursement to encourage better remote care for these patients, I think we're going to see really significant tailwinds in terms of the quality of care improvements for these patients, and then the ability for new technologies like AI-assisted monitoring of patients with congestive heart failure to actually really move the needle on the mortality for some of these diseases and the ability for them to access consistent remote care. And so I think it's really exciting to think about what healthcare looks like once we've provided the incentive and given the reimbursement for clinicians who deliver care not just in the bounds of the hospital, that we can physically stretch the boundary of what healthcare means and what care is provided in a clinical setting versus in a patient's home.
Thank you. As we move from the world of tech and AI, I think one of the things that we all think about and are probably inundated by in our news is the use of drugs and therapies to help us cure ourselves or treat COVID-19. And that world, if you were to bucket them, one, you would see a world of vaccines being developed that hopefully, if they were to work, will prevent you from getting the disease in the future. A second, you see a world of repurposed drugs, where we've taken drugs that have worked for other indications or perhaps other diseases, and we're now applying them, hoping that either it prevents the virus from growing more, so viral growth, or used in things that the disease causes, like inflammation. And those drugs we're repurposing for that. And the third is the category of novel therapies, which also includes things like, perhaps, Daniel, gene editing and the world of CAR-T being used in novel therapies, or even new small molecules and drugs based on new pathways, which we can explore. My first question to you is actually more focused on Excision. Let's start there. You've been the first company in the history to cure an animal of HIV, but Excision is a company which has a viral disease platform, cures for different viral diseases. So are you thinking about COVID-19 at all? And can this technology be applied there?
Yeah, we are actually. Traditionally, as you know very well, Vas, that the foundational technology for Excision removes retroviruses, which are viruses such as HIV, hepatitis B, herpes simplex 1 and 2, that insert their DNA into our DNA in order to replicate. Coronaviruses are different. They do not insert their DNA into ours. They actually use the molecular machinery, but are non-integrating viruses, what they're called. We do have some ideas. In fact, we've put together a proposal to edit out not the viral genome, but instead to edit the receptors. There's two receptors that, if you've seen the images, spike proteins infect mostly on lung epithelium. There's a receptor and co-receptor. So using our technology, we could potentially go in and edit out those receptors, which could not only be a treatment for COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, but also potentially a preventative, not a vaccine as it would be a definition, but more like a shield for not only COVID-19, but for other coronaviruses in general. My biggest hopes for the near term are, as you mentioned, drugs that are either already on the market for another indication or small molecules that can be rolled out to billions of people around the world. A gene therapy approach would really only be used for specific indications, but what it may be able to do is, look, we've seen MERS and SARS before. This is the third in, 15 years of a coronavirus that could be a global pandemic. If history repeats itself, we will probably see another one of these coming. And so to avoid what we're going through now, potentially we could roll out specific gene therapeutics within a matter of days, if it actually works, for the next generation of coronaviruses, to be a preventative treatment for those on the front lines. So that's what we're working with. We're actually on the phone with, as recently as this morning, with the White House for a potential grant for this kind of work. As you can imagine, they're interested in not only COVID, but for national defense purposes, and we'll see where this goes.
Great. And Daniel, can you take a few steps back? People have been thinking about vaccines and Moderna talking about it. Give me your sense on how you think it's going to shake up. You talked about repurposed drugs and you having the most hope there. But how about vaccines? Let's just slowly touch upon that as well.
Yeah, sure. I think everybody has incredible hopes for a vaccine for this, and the sooner the better. I don't know about you, but I field phone calls from friends, family, and colleagues every day on this topic. I don't know if you've noticed, but when the experts show up on news shows or press conferences, there always seems to me, at least, a moment of uncomfortability in their description of viruses, and they get to a place where they stutter like I am right now. And I think one of the reasons for that is a several-fold, and unfortunately, none of them are very simple biologically. First, it just takes time to roll out viruses, and one of those features is not necessarily to make it and get into clinical trials, because we've seen that happen with 6 or 7 potential vaccines already. In fact, there previous vaccines, BCG, is being tested in 2 different trials, already manufactured for other indications. Of course, the Moderna gets a lot of press for being a novel RNA vaccine, and they skipped their primate study, which is a whole other issue we could talk about. But just in terms of proving efficacy in a large population for a vaccine purpose. So remember, this is not a treatment, so you can't look at patients who are infected and then have a very short-term readout. You have to give it to a large number of patients and then statistically look at what are their infection rates. Do they get it? At what frequency? For how long? And then what are the cost benefits? Because what we should talk about is, for every therapeutic in the history of therapeutics, it's always a cost benefit analysis. Every drug has side effects. What are the side effects versus what are the benefits versus what are the not taking it versus not taking it, essentially. So you mix all of these together and you get a bit of a complicated story for when the virus or when the vaccine can be launched. But then there's another feature to coronaviruses, which is a bit complicated. And this is something called disease enhancement or immunology enhancement. And what that means is there's a history of attempted coronavirus vaccines where instead of actually treating, it actually stimulated the immune system to have a worse response in patients who had, not all patients, but in some patients, it was worse than if they didn't have the vaccine at all. The best example that got a lot of press a couple of years ago was the dengue virus vaccine, not a coronavirus, but a flavivirus. And what you saw was in the study that Sanofi did on that vaccine, they did the study they should have done. It was a really well-run study, but they just didn't roll it out to enough patients. And what you saw was in some of the subsets of patients, they got an increase in hospitalization rates after they got dengue if they had gotten the vaccine. So It's not a simple thing, and we're trying to. I know that the people who are doing these trials and running these companies are trying to make sure that there's going to have a good cost-benefit analysis to this, but it just shows you why it takes a little bit longer. I think the big disaster could be, as bad as this is, and it's an absolutely horrific pandemic for so many. I think one of the things in the back of regulators' minds is if we launch a therapeutic that is even more harmful than the virus, that may be the worst of all worlds. So I think there's really still, as fast as everyone's moving and as efficiently as things are moving, and by the way, I've never seen regulatory agencies and companies move this quickly in the industry.
But as we move, before we talk about regulatory, just to close out on vaccines, I'm happy to say, and hopefully I will not stutter when I say it, and I'll say, even if you sequestered the smartest people in the world and put them in a room, gave them all the resources, it would be very, very difficult to come up with a vaccine by the end of this year. Because even if you came up with that magic golden bullet formula, the ability to have a supply chain and the ability for you to manufacture that for mass markets is just not possible. So with that, let's talk about the world. The next thing that we should have hope for, which is the world of treatments. And in that, trials themselves, let's go there. Let's talk about regulatory and trials. But let's start, you brought up regulatory. People often talk about how FDA is the reason why we don't have a drug or other regulatory bodies. Do you feel like you agree with that? Do you feel like the FDA is the holdup, or what are your thoughts? Is it regulatory?
Well, my experience with the FDA and other regulatory agencies as the MEA has not really been that they're the holdups. That in fact, it's more that companies are limiting their own submissions to the FDA, if you will, and not necessarily the regulatory agencies themselves. You could call it a lack of imagination. In fact, my conversations with Janet Woodcock in the past have always been, look, it's not our issue. It's not the FDA's issue. You propose it. If it's reasonable, we'll say yes and move forward. No, that's sometimes the case and sometimes not so much, because it's more than just Janet at the FDA. But in this case, I have seen regulatory agencies move at relative lightning speed. The FDA has a guidance out for the pandemic that they're going to review any submission to the FDA within 24 hours. Now, operationally, I haven't seen that work, and colleagues have told me that with their interactions for COVID trials that it takes a little bit longer than that, but still 48 to 72 hours is still orders of magnitude faster than you usually get responses from the FDA. And I've seen them actually put it into practice, meaning it's not just talk. We've seen different trials that have been envisioned on a Monday, planned with their clinicians on a Tuesday, reviewed with DSMBs on a Wednesday, FDA reviews it Thursday, Friday, and then they're treating patients on Monday, which means so many things have to happen and have to skip, right? Maybe the biggest being contracts with clinical trial sites. Hospitals and clinical trial sites are skipping contracts and indemnification agreements, which often can take months to years to negotiate just to get patients on trial, and then they're getting the lawyers to work on the contracts in retrospect. So I think everybody, and usually that's a no-no with the FDA, but they're being tolerable.
But let's talk about then just trials in general. We saw some of the misinformation outside has been because of poorly run trials, like the trial which informed for hydroxychloroquine, where we saw suddenly it was supposed to be the magic or wonder drug. And yet we saw an open label trial, randomized trial in China, wherein HCQ did not work on patients. Trial designs matter, but can you explain to people like the world of trials and also what adaptive trials are and what trials we're seeing in innovation there, but also why trials are important in healthcare?
Sure. Yeah. No, for everyone, Vas knows how big a fan I am of adaptive trials, which is he loves that. We love talking about this topic. Yes, trial design absolutely matters. And as we go back to the statement about making sure that everyone is safe and as safe as possible, do no harm. The trial design matters. It has to be randomized. It has to be controlled. It has to be have the right types of patient selection, outcomes following. You get the idea in order to keep the public safe. The usual traditional, the historic is maybe a better way to say it, strategy of doing clinical trials is really in series. You do a phase 1, take a look, do a phase 2 and take a look, do a phase 3 and take a look. But in the last 5 years, maybe 10 years, there has been a lot of innovation. Some phase 1s have actually expanded and become their pivotal phase 3s with over 1,000 patients in them, and it's been to the FDA without doing the traditional stopping in the middle. So different, and same is true in Europe, where there has been new flexibility. I think the COVID crisis has changed it in another order of magnitude, where they're greenlighting, I mentioned, trials so quickly, but also being more creative with how to do trials. For example, some of the leaders at the FDA have accessed budgets in order to fund clinical trials themselves. They've reached out to pharma companies and said, just give us your drugs, we'll fund the trials. Let's move this forward. In terms of adaptive trials and platform trials, is the other one I love, is these are trials where in Australia and New Zealand, I think, has the best one that they started in the COVID program, in that they have a trial that are running, I think, 12 different potential COVID therapeutics in parallel. And rather than running one after another, they're running all at the same time, so that at the end of the trial, you'll see which of these is going to be the best. And if they run it in an adaptive way, which I'm not certain that this one is, others are, there are clever ways where you can do Bayesian analysis and actually adapt trials to move the best performing arms of that trial to the ones that are the best outcomes. Meaning, if one of those dozen drugs is better than the rest, the more patients get shunted to that arm, it finishes quickly, and so you have the best of the best done as quickly as possible. So there's lots of creativity, which I think could help bring therapeutics to the masses about as fast as we can come up with.
What are you in this world? Give people a sense of optimism. And what have you seen through this world that we should all be optimistic about?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things we see, clearly, infectious diseases, in the past is kind of area don't get enough attention. And I think this pandemic raised a lot of awareness. The infectious disease is very important. And we already see, more research and funding go into this field. And also we see, kind of like I said, right? So this pandemic actually accelerated our 5 years vision into like a reality today. So it's accelerated adoption of the new technology for healthcare and the public health surveillance.
Yeah, I'm really optimistic about just the ability for us to rethink what it means to deliver healthcare, and to kind of throw off all of our preconceived notions around where healthcare should be delivered, and how payment and fee structures should work. And it's really exciting to see the ways that across the world, all of the healthcare systems are challenged by how do we optimally deliver the highest quality care to the largest number of people. And how do we kind of throw off all of our historic conceptions about where it can be delivered and how technology can be used for that. And it's also wonderful just to see, the entire world united in trying to beat a single enemy, a single foe, and the entirety of the scientific community, tens of thousands of scientists, tens of thousands of researchers, and, probably at this point, tens of thousands of publications, all focused on advancing the tip of the spear, the most innovative technologies, the most innovative solutions to beat this cure and beat this disease. And I think the second and third order effects from all of that innovation, we won't feel those for a few years, but when we do feel them, I think that those will be really significant.
Yeah, and to build on what you see and Connor mentioned, I'm really impressed by the collaboration between companies, public, private, government, to come up with new ideas and new concepts to fight pandemic diseases, potential pandemics. There's so much new innovation and spending and prioritization going into infectious diseases that I think we're going to be much better positioned, not only for coronaviruses in the future, but for others. It's the hangover that you mentioned on your last question that I think we're going to be better positioned as a society and a world to help defend against these things in the future.
Thank you. And if I had to summarize what we've learned today to go over, first of all, we learned that in the world of diagnostics, what we see mostly today are PCR-based tests. We understand the limitations in digital tests that just tell you yes or no. And we've looked at and understood how sequencing perhaps can allow us to understand if this virus can mutate. The good news is we've seen so far that the virus does not mutate very fast. And so these tests could be okay for now, but it enables us to understand how we can prepare for other such viruses in the future. We move from that to serological tests, and we understand that the tests that are out and being marketed do not list sensitivity and specificity. So as you go out to Amazon to buy yourself that serological test, please be careful. Please do talk to a healthcare professional. Please do take with a grain of salt what results come from those tests, because they have not gone through regulatory channels as of yet. As we think about technology and AI, as we heard from Connor, there is that once in 100-year change in reimbursement and regulatory that has happened in the world of digital health, in the world of AI and telehealth and remote monitoring. And that we think is here to stay. Because when we talk to people like leadership at UCSF, they tell us that these patients who have used telemedicine or remote monitoring are more satisfied than when they were actually even coming in person. And that, after all, shouldn't that count for anything? Patient satisfaction? We all care about that. And that, I think, will hopefully allow this to be a more efficient way of triaging and working with patients in the future. And if we think about disease management with the use of drugs, with the use of vaccines, it was a very easy answer about vaccines. We're hopeful for like this moonshot with Gilead, with the world of Moderna, but the likelihood is that a vaccine for mass market will not be ready at least for a year, if not a year and a half to 2 years. But in the meantime, the hope comes from the world of repurposed drugs, that we hope that a remdesivir from Gilead or another such drug for anti-inflammatory will work in alleviating our symptoms and making people recover much faster. As we have novel technologies like DAN and Excision working on viral removal or modification using gene editing can perhaps play a role in putting an end and curing you of such a disease. And as we think about that and move forward, one of the things we leave with hope is the fact that in these troubled times, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. It doesn't matter what race you are, your gender, sexual orientation. We come together as healthcare people, scientists, medical doctors, because we have that one common goal of trying to make someone's life better. We do care about regulatory, not because we want to make your life difficult or make the return on capital and investment difficult. It's because it's your life. It's someone you love, their life, that we're putting into our hands. And for that, there are channels and rules which make it easier for us to have to follow. And you should feel that you can go to bed at night knowing that these rules protect your own life. And with that, I'm happy that we've come together, and what you see here today is that one small glimmer of innovation that is happening in San Francisco. But there are many such companies like this across the world that are trying to address not just COVID-19, but infectious disease response, chronic disease response. And I hope that the next couple of years will give these companies a real chance to make all our lives better. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining.